The lesson was when life explodes is what I had in my outline, and I'm sure Zach talked to you a lot about the content of the previous chapters of Job's speeches, but we've kind of seen the last cycle of speeches with his friends. We've seen them make these accusations against Job. We've seen Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar again. Then this was the third round. Eliphaz spoke, Bildad spoke, but his speech was pretty short, and we don't even see Zophar speak again. So it's kind of how would you describe the current situation between Job and his friends? What's their attitudes toward each other? Sorry? Fed up? Yeah, I guess that's pretty as apt as any. They don't really see any point talking to Job anymore. Job doesn't really see any more point listening to them. It's not helping him. So let's pick up there in chapter 31. And this section was about his final appeal. So how would you describe chapter 31? Some of you guys read it, so how would you describe it? What's Job's message in chapter 31? Sorry?
Trying to figure out why he hasn't found out from God.
He's trying to figure out why he hasn't found out from God, okay. What good he's going to do for him, okay. Anybody else? Still a bit of a why me, for sure. What kind of appeal is he making there in that message? Why does he not deserve what's happening to him? Sorry? Yeah, he wants God to weigh him on Job's scale, and what he thinks is an even scale. Job thinks he's innocent, and basically all of chapter 31 here is an appeal to Job's own righteousness. He's basically talking about how good he is and why he doesn't deserve what's happening to him. If God was just and fair, then this wouldn't be happening to him. Job 31 verses 1 through 4, he talks about how morally pure he is. He's lived with integrity, verses 5 through 8. He has been faithful in his marriage, verses 9 through 12. He has shown no partiality, verses 13 through 15. So again, a lot of this is to combat what the previous friends have accused him of, but yet he's basically saying why he's righteous. He's been charitable, verses 16 to 23. He's remained humble, verses 24 through 28, and shown hospitality, verses 29 through 34. So what do you guys think about that? Is Job being truthful here? Seems like it, right? We have no reason to deny that. That seems to be what was mentioned before, and we see again in chapter 2 that Job was righteous.
They were kind to him, they stood up for him, and he helped
Right.
those that needed help.
Yeah, he was certainly viewed as important, and it seemed like people respected him, and people that were in need knew they could get things from him when they needed them. Verse 35 through 40 records Job's final cry. He calls for God to answer him by declaring what charges he has against Job. Job is basically challenging God to tell him what he's done wrong. Show me what you have against me. Show me the accusations that you have against me. And then verse 40 ends interesting. The words of Job are ended. So that's the end. Right? So that's the end of Job's big discussion with his friends. That's the end of Job's reply to his friends. Everything's been said that's going to be said. So where does that leave us? We're here reading this book, trying to understand who Job is, who God is, how God operates, how God runs the world. What have we learned so far? What have we learned from everything that Job has said? God works in mysterious ways, okay. Yeah. So Job says that he's basically done everything right that he knows to do. He's tried to be very diligent in being righteous and serving God. So what is he to do? I think this lesson and this last set of speeches from Job gives us some good application for our lives of what to do, I think, when our life explodes. And that's why I had that lesson titled that, When Life Explodes. So we're at the end of these speeches. I think it's important for us to consider what we've learned from them, because it's going to set us up for the remainder of the book, particularly this last speech that Job had here. He states many lessons that we have considered throughout our study so far, and I came up with, or at least I found, 9 points that I thought were quite applicable. So I wanted to put them up on the screen so we could talk about them. 9 facts as a foundation for us in times of trial. Oh, it did work. Okay, so the first point is, hopefully you can read that, you can be righteous and suffer immensely. That's one of the big lessons from Job, I think, because that describes who Job was. Job was righteous, yet he still suffered immensely. We've noted this point many times throughout the study of the book. Job is righteous and suffering intensely. And of course, who's another good example of that? Christ, right? Jesus is a great example of being righteous and yet still suffering intensely. So we know that is something that's true. Second, we are to continue glorifying God in the midst of suffering, and that comes from Job 26. And we see the same thing from the Apostle Paul in Romans 5, verses 3 through 5. I'm going to turn there real quick. Romans chapter 5 and verses 3 through 5. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So we have to continue to glorify God in the midst of suffering. We should still be appreciative to God. Number 3. The righteous hope in God to deal with those who wrong us and falsely malign us. So if we're truly righteous people, then we're waiting for God to deal with those people that are evil against us. God is going to take care of those things. It's not up to us to do that. God will deal with those who wrong us, falsely malign us. I'm not sure what's going on with this mic today. Try that. That's from Job 27. Justice is not immediate, but we hope in God for future justice. And we see similar wording in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 19 through 23. So if you want to see 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 19. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure. This is the gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. So again, the attitude of Christ there is a perfect example of that. That's a hard thing for us sometimes, right? We want justice now, right? We want God to work on our timetable and give us justice on our timetable. Try this. Then number 4. Yeah. Thank you, sir. This one actually. The other one I don't think is on in the back right now, but we'll keep going for now. Number 4. The wisdom needed for suffering and wisdom needed for life continues to be in fearing the Lord, Job 28. Even when it seems like fate of the righteous and the wicked are the same, we must know that wisdom still belongs to God. In suffering, we need more of God, not less of God. When we draw closer to him, we need to draw closer to him, not move further from him. And that's also a difficult thing, that when we're faced with suffering, that's a time to get closer to God, not to distrust God or not to fall away from God. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 5 is another example of that. James 1, verses 2 through 5. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. So again, wisdom. Number 5. Technology not cooperating today. Hold on a second. I gotta get over here for this, for the clicker. Okay, we'll put them all up on the screen. Number 5, suffering is not a sign of a lost relationship with God. And again, that's another thing we see Job falling victim to here, right? He thinks that because he's suffering, his relationship with God is somehow failed. Job has repeatedly felt like this. His suffering meant he was God's enemy and that God had left him. But we are given wonderful promises from God that this is not the case. An example there is Hebrews 13, verses 5 through 6. Hebrews chapter 13, starting in verse 5. Keep your life free from love of money and be content with what you have. For he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? So again, a reminder to us that God is not going to leave us. Number 6, enjoy what you have now because it can be gone tomorrow. There's a perfect example from Job. We must never assume that what the way things are today are the way that they will be tomorrow. Like we tend to think things are just going to keep on going just as they are now. That's not necessarily the case. Job, a righteous man, woke up one day and had everything he had taken from him. Everything he had was gone. All he had left was God. And we can see in Ecclesiastes repeatedly notes that life is just a vapor, right? Circumstances are one way, one moment, and then change the next. So if you have something that you can enjoy, appreciate it while you have it. Appreciate what you have enjoyed today. Number 7, remain pure and holy in suffering. From Job 31 and also chapter 27, verses 3 through 5. Nothing proves Satan's assessment more than turning to sin and forsaking God. Imagine if Job, after receiving all this suffering, turned to sin and rebelled against God. Like, what if that would have been Job's reaction? Well, I guess I give up and I'll just sin now because there's no benefit to me. Such a response would prove that he only served God for the good he received. Will we only serve God when life is good, or will we serve God and love God no matter what experiences we have in our life? That's a key question for us today. Number 8, we will not have answers for why we are suffering. And I think that, to me, is one of the big lessons from Job. We will not have answers for why we are suffering. You might think you have the answer. Your friends might think they have the answer. But all of these are just guesses. They're nothing more than guesses. We do not know why we are suffering. When Jesus' disciples encountered the blind man in John chapter 9, they thought there were two options, right? Who sinned? Was it his parents or did he sin? That was the question. But instead, Jesus told them that neither of those two options, neither of their view of the world was correct. To say we know why is to presume the mind and knowledge of God. And we do not know God's intention, and we do not know the reason why. Suffering happens, and we just have to accept that as part of our life. And we're going to talk about that more in today's lesson, because I think Elihu has some really good points about that. The last one there, faith can grow through the trial. That's Job, really all of Job from chapter 3 on so far, 3 through 31. We've seen Job increase in his faith from his early cries in Job 3. We've seen him accurately defend God on many occasions. He says the truthful things. We've even seen him change his view a bit as we've moved through the book. But at the same time, we got to be careful because inappropriate words can also be multiplied. So like when we're suffering, we think about something or have the wrong mindset on something, we can tend to set ourselves in on that, right? To lock ourselves in. So consider growing of your faith and keep control of your tongue through your suffering. I think that's another key point, is to be able to have that kind of discipline, to take it as an opportunity to grow your faith, but also be careful what you say. All right, that was the 9 points I just wanted to put up there because I thought they were a really good summary of kind of Job so far. So anybody have any other comments on that?
For number 6, enjoy what you have now because it can be gone tomorrow. And of course, in Job's case, he lost all his materials and items as well as his family members. The thing that I think of is also the people you're around, your
Yeah.
friends, your loved ones, coworkers, etc. At the end of Job 29, he talks about how he had those people there for him.
Yeah.
Whoever he had helped, they were there. And then in the very first verse of 30, but now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have sustained, but with my sheepdogs, he goes on to tell
Yeah.
that they're gone. So even when you've lost the things in your situation, there's still action from the people that lead you as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even people, the influences in your life change over time. When you have those good influences on your life, that's the time to appreciate them, right? And to take that good influence from them because they may not be there tomorrow. Yeah. Josh?
Also, the point of suffering, if you look at 1 Peter 3, verse 14 and 17, it says, but even if you suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And then verse 17 it says, what is better than if the will of God to suffer for doing good and for doing evil.
Yeah.
So you look at Job's point,
Yep. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So this is the first kind of, I guess the second main part of our series of lessons. Now we're going to get to Elihu and his speeches to Job. So before we go on, are we good? Are we good with Job's friends? Are we good with Job's responses to his friend? We've spent a lot of time talking about those, right? And seeing those arguments. Some of them got to be circular arguments, right? The same points being made over and over again until we've just given up. There's no point talking any further. And that brings us to today's lesson. Why does God allow suffering? Chapter 31 ended telling us that Job's words are done. He's done speaking. The 3 friends of Job had stopped talking. So is everything fixed? Is everything resolved now? No. Didn't really help us at this point. As we're reading this, it's still pretty confusing. There's no resolution to the matter, but before these 4 people, there's no resolution about who God is and how God runs the world. Remember, that was the question we started with this. So there's kind of a stalemate between those 2 camps. His friend's view of how God works, God rewards good people, punishes bad people, and Job's view that, yeah, I kind of think that's true, but yet I'm righteous and I'm being punished and it doesn't make sense. So Job chapter 32, verse 1 tells us the friends stopped answering Job because they are not going to get anywhere with him. Basically, it says he was righteous in his own eyes. So that's their conclusion to the matter. No point talking to Job anymore. He's righteous in his own eyes. Therefore, why bother? Sorry, I'm jumping to Job 32 here. So that brings us to today. Job chapter 32, verse 1 through 5. We're going to read that real quick. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, he burned with anger. So the first question, who is Elihu and where did he come from? Right? Or he just suddenly drops in the story. So who is this guy? Like, you're not expecting that name to suddenly appear, right? So who is this guy? What do you think? Sorry? A tag along? Okay, maybe. He's apparently been there the whole time. Yeah. So he's been there the whole time. He's listened to everything that's been said because he's been very interested in this. So he's a character that's been there and we haven't known about until this point. So where'd he come from? Why is he there? Yeah? Yeah, I think there's probably truth to that, right? I mean, people that knew who Job was, probably some of them felt sorry for them and are at least aware. Maybe they're in the area, they're listening to what's going on, they're trying to comfort him in some way. There's probably other people who thought, that Job, I knew he was going to get what was coming to him, and now they're there to gloat about it, right, or be happy about it. But in any case, apparently there's this group of people there, there's this audience, and they are there and they're listening, and Job's 3 friends have showed up and are talking, and all these people are listening to this. At least we know Elihu is one of them. Maybe he's the only one, but it sounds like there's probably more than that.
He's younger than they are.
Yeah.
Came to respect and
Yeah.
listen. And then I guess it came a time when I've heard enough.
Yeah, so at least we know Elihu's younger than them. He thought, well, in reverence to these older people that have wisdom, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. Right? I'm not going to get involved. I'm going to listen because I want to learn too, right? I'm sure he was very curious of why this was going on, why it was happening to Job. Had Job sinned or what had happened? So he's there to hear. He's keeping his mouth shut because he's being respectful. But when all this finishes and his friend stops speaking and Job stops speaking and the matter's done, he's like, well, wait a minute. There's a lot to say here. And you guys are not talking anymore, so I'm going to talk. So that's kind of where we're at this point. He's angry because, according to verse 4, he kept quiet because all 4 of these men were older than him. So he remained silent and listened while they spoke. What's his attitude at this point, though? A little disgusted, it seems. It says he burned with anger.
I like verse 7. I had it marked, and I think I read that to my kids one time. That a multitude of years should keep with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. They're not always wise.
Right. We're going to get to that, right?
I didn't read them that.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Elihu's really mad. Why is he mad? Why is he mad at Job specifically? Yeah, Job is justifying himself. He's talking about why he's righteous. He's not justifying God. He's justifying himself. Why is Elihu angry at the 3 friends? Verse 12. I gave you my attention, and behold, there was none among you who refuted Job or who answered his words. Yeah.
Well, like I said, in verse 7, he was trying to tell them, speak up, because you're older and you got the wisdom.
Yeah.
And multitude of years.
Yeah, so he's mad at them because they're accusing Job. Well, Job, you must have sinned. We know you've sinned. Come on, Job, confess. You've sinned. And yet Job's giving them these answers, and they don't have any answers for Job. Instead, they're just repeating their accusation again and again. They don't have any answers to Job's words. So when he sees the 3 friends of Job have no answer, he burns with anger, and he basically is done with these 4 people. So the one big question for everyone when we get to this part of the book is, how should we read Elihu and treat his advice? Is he going to offer godly counsel, or is he just another friend of Job that's going to accuse Job of things? He certainly wants to, but Job's 3 friends also said they were going to provide godly counsel, right?
I think he was chastising the 3 friends more than what Job.
Okay. So what do you guys think? Okay. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna talk about that a little bit more too, where that wisdom comes from. But certainly, that's an answer as to why he may have wisdom, whereas these wise men, quote unquote, didn't. Okay, is he? Okay, so he's going to declare his opinion. Is his opinion a good opinion or a bad opinion? That's something for us to figure out. Now, I will say, if you look at Bible commentaries and scholars and do reading on this, you'll see that they're confused as well. Like there seems to be some division there. Some people think Elihu's coming into this and he's just this angry, young, brash guy, windbag that's just going to come in and repeat a bunch of accusations. Other people think Elihu's going to, give him some godly wisdom that they've been lacking up to this point. So there's kind of a split on that as to how he's going to be, or how people think he's involved in the story. So we got to be careful when we read the text that we're looking for evidence, whether his testimony is godly testimony or not. That's something I had in my notes here. First, some people reject Elihu because he says a lot of the things that sound like what the three friends say. Like a lot of what he says sounds really similar to what the three friends have said that Job has already rejected. But that shouldn't really sway us in either direction, because if you've noticed, his friends often are saying truthful things. They're saying things from the scriptures. They're just messing up the application of them. They're twisting them into meaning something that they're not intending to mean. So that doesn't necessarily tell us something. Yes? Sorry? I don't think we know, yeah. We don't know if he's a friend of Job or an enemy of Job or anything else. Yeah, yes, and I think that's an important point, right? We're going to get to as well. He just appears in the story. We don't really know much about him or why he's there or what point he's going to make. We don't know how he's related to Job, how he's allied with Job or not. But again, the question is, what's he saying, and is there wisdom in what he's saying? Also, it wouldn't make a lot of sense in this passage that we're reading here if Elihu's just going to repeat what the friends have said and do it in an angry way, because we've already heard all the arguments of the friends and they haven't gotten us anywhere. They haven't been able to give Job an answer, 32 verses 3 and 5. Some people reject Elihu because he's angry at these three friends and at Job, but that's not necessarily a fair criticism. We're going to read later that God is angry at the three friends and at Job, and that's 42 verse 7. And with Job in chapter 40 verse 8, for the exact same reasons that Elihu brings up. So Elihu's anger can easily be described as a righteous anger because of what these four people are saying about God and how God runs the world. So it could be that he just has a opinion that's correct and he's just angry because they're misrepresenting who God is. We'll also see as we go on into the passages where God speaks that God makes some of the same charges that Elihu does here. You'll also see Elihu say things that God will say in his speeches when we get to those sections. So there's clearly some connection here with what God is talking about. Also, let's look at the text here to see if it can help us decide about Elihu. One other thing, what happens every time one of Job's friends speaks? What immediately follows their speech to Job? So they make an accusation against Job. What happens after that? There's always a response from Job to rebut what they've said, right? There's always a, no, you're wrong because. No, you don't understand because. There's always a contradiction here. What about Elihu's speech? We don't see a response from Job, do we? Right, the words of Job have ended. So there's an interesting difference there. Each one of Job's friends have spoke, there's a rebuttal against it that Job makes. But Elihu, he doesn't try. Even Elihu in this passage will ask Job to respond. Job doesn't respond. Second, Elihu has the longest speeches, given 4 speeches, which are longer than what the three friends give. So he's given a lot of time to speak. You can take that for what it's worth. Third, he's not rebutted. Again, we mentioned that. Every time a friend gives a speech, there's a response, but not in this case. And finally, Elihu's speech introduces God. We'll see God come in after these speeches from Elihu. And again, we're talking about poetry here, so the structure of the way this is set up is kind of important. So what Elihu says then kind of seamlessly transitions into God's arrival. So there may be some importance to that. So you could say that Elihu could be seen as a forerunner preparing the way for God's arrival to speak to everyone in the book. And I kind of like that analogy there. That's an interesting way to look at it. So I kind of think Elihu's words are more godly counsel than they are just another brash friend coming in accusing Job. And that's kind of the way I viewed it as I go through there. But I fully admit that's not the way I originally viewed it. Definitely some of his words sound just like another set of accusations. So let's go ahead and get further into Elihu's speech here because we're rapidly running out of time. So Job chapter 32, let's see, do we have time to read this? Well, I don't think we're going to read it just because of how much time we have left. Hopefully you guys have had time to read that ahead of time. But in verses 6 through 22, so the rest of chapter 32, before Elihu can offer instruction, he has to prepare these people to listen to him. I think that's the way I look at that he's basically setting the stage to listen to them. Some people, again, say that his attitude's kind of brash here and that he's not being respectful. But again, he's angry at what's going on. Because he was young and thought the others would teach wisdom, he remained quiet. That's verses 6 through 7. He declares that he will use godly wisdom in verse 8. So he definitely says, I'm going to tell you about God. Question is that true? That's the same thing that his friends have said, Job's friends have said. And that he is able to possess godly wisdom even though he's young in verse 9. Yeah, and that's what the verse that we came up with. Is it not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right? That's the way we expect, but yet even though he's young, he still has wisdom in his mind. So he asked everybody to listen to him, verses 10 through 12. Elihu challenges the three friends that they need to take responsibility for the counsel that they give in verse 13. If they're telling Job all these things, you better be sure what you're saying is correct, and you're responsible for what you're telling Job. They should be able to correct Job. They shouldn't just have to wait for God to do it, like this whole point of them giving up. Elihu clarifies that the arguments he will make will not be the same arguments that the three friends have made, verse 14. He's not just going to repeat their accusations against Job. So there's a difference, at least he says, on what he's going to say. And he has much to say, verses 15 through 22, but he will be fair to Job at verse 21, declaring the truth in a straightforward manner, verse 22. Okay, and that brings us to chapter 33. Anybody else have any comments on chapter 32, this introduction to Elihu, before we go on?
Verse 15, they were amazed at what Elihu said.
They were amazed at what he said, yeah. Excuse me. Anybody else? Okay. Let's go on to chapter 33. I'd really like to read this, but we'll read it real quick. Job chapter 33, verses 1 through 33. But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all of my words. Behold, I open my mouth, the tongue of my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Behold, I am toward God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you. Surely you have spoken in my ears, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure without transgression. I am clean, and there is no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasions against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths. Behold, in this you are not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words? For God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds. Then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from the deed and conceal pride from a man. He keeps back his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread and his appetite the choicest food. His flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000, to declare to man what is right for him, and he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. The man prays to God, and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, I sinned and perverted what was right. I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down into the pit, and my life shall look upon the light. Behold, God does all these things twice, 3 times with a man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. Pay attention, O Job, listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. If you have any words, answer me, speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. Okay. So this chapter here, Elihu's he declares that he has the Spirit of God, and the words he gives are inspired, verses 3 through 4. He knows God, and he's going to explain God. But Elihu says he is only a human also, and his pressure is not going to be heavy on Job, verses 5 through 7. I understand what you're going through, in a sense, right? I'm not going to treat you unfairly. I'm not going to be heavy against you. So if we think again about Job's 3 friends, their attitude toward Job is, Job, we're looking at you, we see your life, therefore we know you've sinned. That's their attitude. How is Elihu different? How is his view of Job different? He thinks he ought to repent? I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that. Verse 8 specifically is where I'm getting at. Okay, certainly sin, he's talking about sin in general. It's a common thing that happens to people. How is verse 8 different than Job's other 3 friends? Yeah. It's like, Job, I heard what you said. I'm not going to come to you and accuse you because I see your life, I see your situation. Instead, you, Job, you have said these words. So I'm going to challenge you based on your own words, not based on your circumstance, not based on what your life looks like. But I'm going to make accusations against you because of what you have actually said. So his attitude towards Job is, whether Job is being honest or not, Job has said these things, and these things I can't let stand. I'm going to rebut, or I'm going to bring up. He's going to challenge Job's words according to what Job has said. He's not going to make things up, but he's quoting words that he heard from Job, chapter 33, verses 9 through 11. And we see that Job has said these words in Job 13, verses 24, 27, Job chapter 16, verse 9, Job chapter 19, verses 7 and 11. So he's picking out things that Job has said in his speeches, and he says, I'm going to challenge you on those things. Elihu's correction is going to be based on the words he heard Job say, and that's really different than what his 3 friends have done so far, that the attacks they have made. You say that you are right and that God has no answer for you. That's what you're saying, Job. So God has invented reasons to oppose you so that he treats you as his enemy. And this is Elihu says in verse 12 that you are not right to say that. Is that true? Does God invent reasons to oppose us? Certainly not. That is something that Job is kind of implying by what he says.
Elihu
Yeah.
I mean, he had all this justification, how righteous he was, and why was God doing this, but this guy's kind of saying, you have no right to even ask the question.
Okay. We're gonna touch on that a little bit more as we go on. Absolutely. How can you say that God would have no answer for your words in verses 12 through 13? That's pretty bold. That's pretty arrogant. It's like, God, you're not treating me justly, and you have no answer for me, God, as to why that's true. That's not a good attitude to have before God. Why would God have no answer for you? That's pretty arrogant. Why are you contending against God with your words? Consider that Elihu is right because God says the same thing to Job in chapter 40, verse 2, when we eventually get there. Who are we to say that God must answer us? Back to your point. Why must God give us an answer? Who are we to say that God would have no answer if you're going to contend with him? Elihu's message is this: God does speak, and he speaks through suffering. And that's the key point of today's lesson, which we don't have time to get to, but we're going to run through real quick. We'll probably pick it up again next week. But I think the key point of his message here in verses 14 through 18, if you remember in the patriarchal period, God could speak directly to people. He spoke directly to people, often through visions, through dreams. During the patriarchal and Mosaic times, if you think about Joseph and Nebuchadnezzar, the prophets. But God speaks another way, and this is what Job needs to listen to. He's telling Job, God speaks through your suffering. When you're suffering, God is speaking to you. The friends have said that suffering is a consequence for sins, but Elihu says that God can also use suffering purposefully. And notice the purpose in verses 17 through 18 here. That he may turn man aside from his deed and conceal pride from man. He keeps back his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. So the purpose of the suffering can sometimes be God speaking to you to correct you. And we've talked about this in the past, that we do see suffering in our lives, and a lot of time that suffering is there to dissuade us from sin, to alert us to the fact that there's sin going on, so that we can be restored. And this is a point that we're gonna carry forward. We're out of time today, so I don't really want to go much further with that. We're out of time. We'll definitely pick back up in chapter 33 here. Let's see. So we're here at verse 18. We'll try to start there again next week. But I want you to think about this idea of suffering and God using suffering as a way to speak to us. Because I think Elihu's point here is pretty accurate. God, through his words, through his actions, keeps humans from the worst possible fate. Elihu says that if we did not have suffering, we'd fall into this pit, right? God does not allow suffering because we are his enemies, which is what the point Job is trying to make. But God uses suffering to instruct us. And the discipline of God is grace to save us. Okay, so we'll pick up there next week. And again, that's a big important point that we didn't really get to today, but I want to talk about again. So for next week, try to finish reading the rest of Elihu's speeches. So that will be chapters 34 through chapter 37. So if you read the rest of Elihu's, hopefully we'll have time to wrap all that up next week. If not, we'll keep going. Any other comments before we're done here? All right. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the comments today.